Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event on what is currently happening in Lebanon, the Lebanese revolution that was re-sparked recently due to the tragic explosion. But the things happening in Lebanon right now are quite inspiring. So just a bit about us. My name is Sarah. I'm a member of Fight Back. We are a socialist organization here in Canada. We're part of a larger international organization called the International Marxist Tendency. And we are for building socialism in our lifetime. That's what we fight for. That's what we aspire to. So the event today is going to be presented by Adam Zinedine, who will speak shortly. And basically what's gonna happen is he's gonna speak for maybe 30, 45 minutes, something along those lines. And afterwards, we're gonna have a discussion. We want this event to be as normal as possible, despite the fact that it's happening online. I also wanna invite you all to share the live stream on Facebook on our Fight Back main page. If you're attending this event, then please share this as widely as possible. So the other thing I wanted to mention before we get the event going is this event costs us some money to have. The Zoom account is not free. We have a special Zoom account that we're able to have a certain amount of participants and so on and so forth. So if you want to help support our cause, support what we fight for, I'm gonna send a link in the chat shortly to help fundraise for the event. So that's about it. I don't have much else to add. I'm gonna give the right, there's gonna be discussion afterwards, which everyone's gonna be welcome to participate in. I'll speak more a bit about that towards the end of Adam's, after Adam finishes speaking. And without further ado, I'm gonna leave it off to Adam. Adam, I'm gonna unmute you in just a second, hold on.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to see so many people here interested in learning about what's going on in Lebanon right now, which by all accounts is a very amazing development in the sense that the slogan of the Lebanese revolution, for people who don't know, is all of them means all of them. So this revolution, which began really last year in October and is still ongoing, is a revolution not just against what's going on in this or that situation in Lebanon, but an indictment of the entire ruling elite in Lebanese society. And this has become, really the backdrop of the revolution. Since October of last year, you had the masses of Lebanon, which have struggled and toppled not one, but two governments in less than a year. And so this slogan of really attacking the entire political ruling establishment in Lebanon is important, especially in the context of the Middle East, where you have similar situations, not just in Lebanon, but in Egypt and Iran, in Syria, in Jordan, in all of these Arab countries, which are facing similar crises, and the ruling class in these countries cannot resolve them. But in Lebanon specifically, I think the reason that this slogan resonates is because it's uniting everyone. And this is impressive because Lebanon, for people who don't know, is a deeply divided country by religion. Since its very inception, it's been torn by sectarian differences. It's always been a country where many religions lived side by side for thousands of years, relatively peacefully. But when the French colonized Lebanon, in the early 1900s, they played a role in heightening these cultural and religious differences and using them as a way to control the region. And they would intentionally, for example, attack the Muslim population and elevate the Christians, giving them, a loyal and wealthy minority that would support their colonization and so on. And this situation in what we call the French Mandate, even after the French left the country, it left behind a political system based around these religious divisions in which different, political positions are tied to whatever religion you happen to have. So it's not really a true democracy. And this was cemented, especially at the end of the Lebanese Civil War in 1990, where you had all of these sectarian political leaders, which really were warlords. The country was divided in a civil war. And these warlords, came together and agreed to a peace where they would share power. this power sharing agreement called the TAF agreement. And it really was just legalizing corruption, right? And the ability for them to loot and rob the country. And of course, who would pay for this? It would be the Lebanese masses. So the sectarian divisions really in society in Lebanon really come from the top of society and are handed down to the masses. If you grow up in Lebanon, you're taught this from a very young age. Even actually the birth certificates in Lebanon, you cannot have one unless you state what religion you are. So it's that kind of ingrained in people. But this movement, what it's done is actually unite everyone, no matter what their religious background is, no matter what political affiliation they were born into, and instead united them, the entire mass of people, against the ruling elite, which are the real criminals in Lebanese society, that have robbed and really butchered the masses for decades and decades. And this all came to a head on August 4th when many people saw there was a massive explosion in Beirut. About 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded. This is a chemical that's often used in fertilizer and explosives. And about 170, 250 people have been dead, cited dead on arrival to the hospital, which was completely overwhelmed with people. And over 5,000 were injured, and hundreds are still missing. So this death toll is actually climbing. And as soon as this happened, people started to kind of speculate, what caused this explosion? Is it was it for example, Hezbollah, which is a known militant terrorist group in Lebanon? Was it Israel? And actually, it was quickly found out that it was the neglect and corruption of the government, right? The actual government that's in power, the officials that caused this explosion. They knew about this nitrate. They knew about it for years, in fact, and they simply left it there in the middle of a city, knowing that it could cause an explosion like this. In fact, just 2 weeks before the explosion, the president of Lebanon, Aoun, got information about the nitrate, and he didn't do anything. So he got the info that it was still there, it should be moved, it's dangerous. And when confronted with this, he said, I don't have any power. I'm just the president. So they're completely deflecting blame. The government's blaming port officials. Port officials are blaming other officials, etc. It's just kind of a big circle. And who pays for the neglect and corruption of these people that are in power? Of course, the Lebanese masses, right? They're the ones that actually suffer. They're the ones that are forced to bear the brunt of the complete incompetence of these people. And for us in the international Marxist tendency, our response is simple. They're all to blame. All of them means all of them. They're all meant to. They should all be blamed. Every member of the ruling class in Lebanon has caused this, and thousands have been injured, hundreds killed, and for what? And Lebanon was already a country that was struggling. It's important to point out that this process of revolution, it's not just that this revolution kind of happened as a response to the explosion. It's been building for a very long time. It's been digging under the surface for decades and decades even. So Lebanon's been facing horrible conditions for an extremely long time. Just to name a few things. The government in Lebanon isn't even able to handle something as simple as garbage disposal due to the corruption and bribery in the system. In 2015, for example, there was this crisis where the government just would not handle garbage disposal. They just leave it out in the streets of Beirut. And you had a huge protest movement at that time, forcing them, right, to actually do something. And now they kind of handle the garbage, not really. If you go to Beirut, it used to be a very beautiful city. Now it's completely in decay. Obviously, now it's devastated. But I mean, I was there, just a few years ago, just last year, and you can kind of walk in the streets and you see that there's just garbage piling up everywhere because the government just doesn't arrange for it to be picked up due to corruption and bribery and so on. Even waste disposal from the sewage system is not handled properly in Lebanon. It's just dumped into the Mediterranean Ocean. It's gotten so bad, you can actually look at Google Maps and you can see it piling up. The satellites can actually see it from space. That's how horrible it is. Even electricity, a basic, you would think, necessity. On average, people in Lebanon don't have electricity for 16 hours of the day. So, there's people, just families that talk about how they have to plan their daily activities based around the cutoffs, no hot water at certain times. You can't wash clothes at certain times. You have to throw away food that goes rotten because fridges don't work, you know. And why is this? Again, why does this happen? Well, there's private generator industries which operate kind of like a mafia, and they're connected to all the politicians. So there's these bribes and corruption that go on, so that the ruling elite don't even have to provide basic, electricity to people. And of course, it's important to point out they don't suffer from any of this, right? So the people in power, of course, they live very comfortable, very good lives, right? They're extremely wealthy. And they certainly don't have to deal with electricity cutoffs. They certainly don't have to deal with, the problems of garbage disposal. They have that all taken care for them, right? So, coupled with this, you also have the deep economic issues, which again, the working class has to deal with in Lebanon. It's one of the most indebted countries in the world, despite being one of the smallest. And this is because the government routinely gambles and embezzles state money. They just take it and use it for themselves. Ministers will enter the government in Lebanon with no assets and leave owning millions. One minister, for example, who was, I think, the nephew of the president, entered the government as just a simple school teacher. And when he left his post a year later, he had a private jet. So this is the kind of bullshit that happens in this country. It's absolutely absurd. And it led the government multiple times to run out of money, obviously, and to ask for money to be lent to them, right, from various international investors. And eventually they just defaulted on their debt, which caused a massive inflation crisis where the currency has lost 80% of its value. Imagine for a moment, just one moment, being paid 80% less, right? So you go to work, you work for a week, a month, whatever, and you get 80% less of your paycheck because 80% of the currency is useless. So, it's absolutely absurd. So the prices that have soared as a result. A single piece of meat in Lebanon right now is 33 US dollars. It's gotten so expensive that the government isn't actually buying meat for the soldiers anymore. They've just, thank you. They've just cut that out of, the the diet of the army because it's just too expensive. The UN has estimated that 50% of Lebanese people will drop into poverty this year. Right now, there's actually over 50% youth unemployment, people between the ages of 18 and 30. Over half of them don't have a job and are unable to get a job. And even more importantly, there's actually an incoming hunger crisis that's happening because Lebanon imports about 85% of its food, and the port, due to the blast, was destroyed, right? And on top of this, the blast also took away the food reserves, which were kept at the ports. So in the next few months, it's estimated that Lebanon will begin to actually face this hunger crisis. And of course, the ruling elite, they're completely oblivious. They've done nothing to resolve any of these problems. Complete incompetence, corruption, all they care about is lining their own pockets at the expense of the working class in Lebanon. But it's important to point this out because Lebanon's not actually a poor country. It's not a deeply, destroyed or poor country by any sense. Many political dynasties in Lebanon have billions in wealth and assets. And they're mostly created these fortunes through theft from the national reserves. And they defend themselves through this sectarian political system. So effectively, they steal, and then they say, no, but we care about, our own religion or our own, portion of the working class in Lebanon. Some of the wealthiest men in Lebanon, such as the previous prime minister that was brought down in October of last year, Saeed Hariri, he comes from a family that has billions upon billions. despite coming from one of the poorest areas in Lebanon, Tripoli, right? And many of these people have been in government before and have used this as a way to garnish wealth and gain power. So, you know, this means that the revolution in Lebanon, I see this often, is sometimes characterized as kind of a nation coming together against a couple of corrupt thieves, in government. And it's important to understand that's not what's happening at all. This is actually a class issue. It's the working class in Lebanon uniting on class lines, and uniting not just against this or that politician, but against the entire criminal, corrupt system that has brought them into this situation. This is the system of capitalism, effectively, which allows a minority of people to run society, to dictate whatever they want within a country, to do whatever they want with the billions that they accrue. And the working class can just suffer the brunt of their incompetence and their negligence. So it's really a working class revolution that we're seeing. So the movement itself, talk a bit about it. Considering these conditions, the movement, arising as an outcry against what's going on makes perfect sense. I mean, it's the accumulated frustration and suffering of the Lebanese masses. Like I mentioned, it actually began last year in October, where you had the government announce attacks on WhatsApp calls. WhatsApp is often used as a way to communicate in Lebanon because it's pretty cheap. And this was kind of the final straw because people were dealing with so much already. And it's an incredibly impressive movement just because of the scale of it. At the height of it in late October, 2 million people were in the streets. Some media outlets were even saying, 3 million. And Lebanon is actually only a country of 6 million people. So that means 30 to 50% of people were participating in this movement. They were out in the streets, etc. This huge movement, was quite powerful. But it also had kind of a mixed bag in terms of demands, and there was effectively really no leadership. It was just an outcry of anger. So you had all kinds of demands. You had the demands for reforming the system and punishing the corruption, but you also had more radical demands, things like the demand for healthcare, electricity, increased wages, and even some people were demanding an entirely new system to be put in place, an overthrow of the current system. So in many ways, the revolution itself began to personify the change that it wanted to see. And what I mean by this is, as the protesters began to occupy Martyrs Square, it's this big square in Beirut that was set up, I believe, at the end of the Civil War. As they began to occupy this in the thousands, they actually began to distribute medical supplies. They began to give food to hungry people. And there was even talk of seizing resources from the government and putting them to use for the people. So the revolution was advancing, quite quickly. This, of course, horrified the ruling class in Lebanon. They realized that they had to give some kind of concession if they wanted to stay in power. And so they resigned in October. This was the old government. Said Hariri stepped down. And in was ushered Hassan Diab, which was the most recent prime minister, who formed a new government. And they did this to appease the masses, of course. They weren't interested in changing anything at all with the system. They just wanted to kind of allow the masses to let off some steam, promise some reforms, and then wait until they were in a better position. People, of course, being inexperienced in politics and having effectively no leadership to this movement, many of them went home, and they decided to give this government a chance. You still had, some sporadic movements throughout the year, but not on the scale as before. So it's important to point out that with the Hassan Diab government, nothing changed, nothing at all. So this government was in power for 9 months, and it passed some anti-corruption legislation here, a little bit of kind of a small reform here and there, but nothing fundamentally shifted in the situation. And this led most recently to a revival in the movement, especially in the wake of the Beirut explosion, which everyone in Lebanon really agrees was due to the neglect of the current government. And this led to thousands and thousands of people streaming back into the streets, 10,000 people in Martyr Square once more. There were even calls from these protesters most recently, just over the past week, to join, for the soldiers to join the protesters, saying, come join us. How are you? You're not even getting paid. The government's not even paying you. Join us and let's actually form a new Lebanon. So they've been appealing to the army to help them against the corrupt ruling class. It's actually quite scandalous because in response, the government, before its resignation, unleashed the army and the police on the masses, when before they actually were refusing to use the army to clean up the streets in Beirut that were devastated. They were actually pulling them back to the barracks. And this is because they knew that there was going to be protests and they wanted to have the army in reserve to crush these protests. So the protesters were actually leading up most of the cleanup of the city. They were forming, small committees and teams to clean up parts of Beirut, etc. And it's fundamental to understand that in this movement, it's not, just a couple of young people, demanding some kind of revolution. It was actually some of the most oppressed people in society. Things like, you'd have 50-year-old mothers that would go to these protests with their kids, people who have lived through the last civil war, right? That would be tear gassed and attacked with rubber bullets by the army, and the cops who were refusing to help with cleanup in the city. And they would be tear gassed and attacked, and they would just go back in, right? The repression didn't stop the movement at all. And this meant that obviously the government got scared, and resigned once more. What's important to point out here is the enormous courage that the masses are showing. It's really quite inspirational. I've personally, never really quite seen anything like it, where you have people who have been unable to get a meal for consistently for weeks and weeks and weeks. They've had their pay cut. Many of them have lost their homes. 300,000 people lost their homes in this blast. And despite all of this, they're uniting together and opposing a corrupt regime that has led them to this impasse. So the courage they've shown is incredible. But it's important to understand why the Diab government was unable to provide reforms. Because this was a big demand of the earlier movement. The earlier movement was demanding what we would call a technocratic government, right? So a government, instead of a government of politicians, it would be a government of professionals. This was the call before. A lot of people will talk about this. But this is really a utopian demand. It doesn't actually come about in reality, and there's a reason for that. The problem with it is that the ruling class in Lebanon really fundamentally was not challenged. It didn't change in any real way. All the power, the money, the industry in Lebanon, and even the government itself remained in the hands of the ruling class. So how could this technocratic government, do any kind of reforms when the real problems remained? I mean, for example, Hezbollah, one of the biggest parties in Lebanon that's been in government since 2018, Hezbollah actually supported Hassan Diab and the new government. Thanks, Sarah. That was, they supported the new government. And the reality is the state, as in the machine of the government, anywhere in the world, but especially in Lebanon, functions at the whim of the ruling class. All the functionaries, all the legislators, all of the judiciary people that the masses were looking to, these people weren't impartial, right? They're connected to some form of the political elite. They're connected to the old system. So they couldn't really reform a system. It was tantamount to asking the people in power to reform themselves, right? This is a system that benefited them. They were part and parcel, this new government, of the old ruling class. They were not new, right? And all the corruption legislation in the world, all the anti-corruption legislation in the world, no matter how many papers you write, no matter how many laws you pass, no one will enforce it because the state is in the hands of the ruling clique that is using it for this purpose. Technocrats don't really appear out of the sky and fall down completely pure for us to use in government. That's just not how it works. The people that find themselves in positions of power are supported by the people that created that power. in the first place. So it's the same criminals, the same crooks that were robbing people, and yes, even killing them, as we saw with the blast in Beirut. And to exemplify this, I'll give you an example. Aoun, the president, and the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah remained in power. Nothing changed. So they've been in power even after the old revolution. They didn't leave at all, right? And then you've had kind of other parties that have attempted to join the revolution. So people have started to look to these other organizations that are more pure, right? They haven't been in government during this horrible time. Maybe we can look to them, right? Parties like you have the kind of Christian Kataib party, this kind of right-wing Christian party that was founded on the ideas of Mussolini, actually, a very fascist-leaning party. Or even the Sunni parties like the Future Movement, which were removed from power before. Why don't we look to these people instead to help us, to help run the society? And it's important to understand these people are tied to the sectarian system, right? So even though they've been involving themselves in the revolution in small ways, and even though they're not in government, right, they don't care about the masses. They really have no interest in helping the masses at all. Their demands, to give you an example, is what they're calling a disarmed city, or Beirut is a peaceful city. And this is really code language. What it means is they want Hezbollah to give up weapons. Hezbollah is the only party in Lebanon that still maintains its arms from the civil war. And a big demand by these other parties is to give up the weapons that Hezbollah has. And the problem with injecting the movement with this kind of rhetoric is what you're really saying is, if Hezbollah didn't exist, right, if Hezbollah was removed from the situation, and these other parties, Kataib Party, the Future Movement, all of these people were in power instead, Lebanon would not be in this position. And that's fundamentally untrue. All of these people, no matter what party they come from, the entire political establishment in Lebanon is tied to the sectarian system, benefits from it, and is interested not in changing the situation and reforming things so that Lebanon is a brand new country where we can all live in peace, etc., and have good jobs and healthcare, all these things. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in is taking power away from their enemies and doing the same shit, right? So they won't change anything. This is the fundamental problem. So even though they've tried to kind of position themselves as friends of the revolution or put themselves at the head of the revolution, the masses cannot trust them because these people are fundamentally tied to the system. They're part and parcel of the same problem. They're not a solution. But to give you an example of what they've been trying to do, so there was a protest at the foreign ministry, for example, and this protest was headed up by retired generals and retired army officers. And it was later found out that one of the people that had raised the slogan of disarming Hezbollah at this protest was actually tied to the Kataib party and was coming out and saying that, oh, the Kataib is actually a friend of the revolution, etc. So it's this kind of rhetoric that's actually very dangerous, right? Because it changes the revolution from a united struggle of all the masses across all sectarian lines against sectarianism, against the corruption, and against the ruling class, to a struggle of one religion or party against another religion or party. It effectively divides the ruling class and separates them. So not only would they not change anything, it would actually weaken the masses. The great power of this movement, the enormous power of it, is its ability to overcome these sectarian divisions. And these sectarian divisions, like I mentioned before, they're not, something that are inherent to society in the Middle East. And we see it in other countries too. In Syria, you had similar divisions. In Saudi Arabia, you have similar divisions, etc. Across the whole region, the ruling class tries to use religion as a way to divide the masses. But it really comes from the top. It's only in the interest of the ruling class to divide people this way. So this is why the masses in Lebanon can't rely on any of these parties that are tied to the sectarian system. It would simply weaken the struggle overall. The other group of people that has been making overtures to the movement and trying to help it are the forces of imperialism. So a part of the issue in Lebanon, in particular, all of these parties, how they maintain their power is actually capitalist powers outside of Lebanon are tied to these parties and influence these parties and use them to maintain control of the region based on the old sectarianism that was established. Hezbollah in Iran is a good example. You also have the Kataib Party and the French. You have the Future Movement and Saudi Arabia, right? So you have all of these international actors that are interested in maintaining Lebanon politically as a safe market, right, for them to make a quick buck, right, and maintain control of the Middle East. So it's this kind of game that they play. And the pawns in this game are the masses, right? So in the aftermath of the fall of the government, America and France, are upping the pressure. Actually, Macron, the president of France, was the first world leader to be in Beirut after the explosion. And people were even looking to him for solutions. There was a petition online to revive French rule, which gained, I think, 80,000 signups. And Macron was like, no, of course, we would never consider, running Lebanon again. Lebanon has to be free and independent. But we encourage Lebanon to make a deal with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF, trying to bail Lebanon out has become something that the movement is talking about. But it's important not to fall for this because obviously the IMF is a financial institution and their interest is making a profit. And who would they make pay for this profit? How would they bail Lebanon out? They wouldn't just give money to the Lebanese government out of the kindness of their own hearts. They would do it at the cost of what they call reforms. And what they mean by reforms isn't democratic reforms, a change to the sectarian system. What they mean is privatizations of industry. So there would be mass layoffs in Lebanon, more than there are now. There would be wage cuts, right? There would be cuts to any social programs, things like education, etc. All of the development that Lebanon has made due to past struggles and past revolutions in the country would be cut back under the kind rule of the IMF. So the IMF would say, no, Hezbollah shouldn't be in power. Instead, you should make a deal with France and America and us democratic countries that really care about democracy and care about you, Lebanese people, and maintain the same system as before, except now under the kind and benevolent eyes of the International Monetary Fund, which will take your livelihoods and force you to pay huge sums to this international institution. And it would just generally cut the living standard of the Lebanese people. So they would make the Lebanese masses pay for the corruption of the ruling class. They wouldn't fundamentally change anything. So these overtures by imperialism are quite not good, right? And it's the same, by the way, with Hezbollah and Iran. These kinds of outside powers are not interested in any fundamental change. And in many ways, they've actually created this situation. Thank you. So, for example, the government, one of the governments that constantly would bail out the ruling class in Lebanon would be the Macron and the French government. They would often give money to the Lebanese government and would call the Lebanese people their eternal friends, such kind language. But in reality, they have no interest in helping people. They just want to control the situation. So it's not a solution, this imperialism. It's a big part of why Lebanon is the way it is today, actually, is these outside actors instead. So, what needs to happen instead then? What is the alternative? Well, there is an alternative to this. You don't have to choose imperialism and you don't have to choose the same old sectarian system. What you actually can look to, and what we should look to, is the masses themselves, which have shown an enormous amount of power in how they've operated, an enormous amount of courage. They've toppled 2 governments in less than a year. They've shown an enormous amount of potential. And even though, one of the biggest problems I would say that the movement is facing is that it doesn't have kind of a core leadership, this is actually the best hope for Lebanon and the Lebanese masses, is this ongoing revolution and movement that threatens the ruling class and threatens to actually change everything in Lebanon. So what's needed is for the workers to trust themselves, They shouldn't look to the IMF or the imperialists, and they shouldn't look to any kind of sectarian or political leadership in the already existing institutions in Lebanon, which are the same criminals that have put them in this situation. No, they have to actually trust themselves. So the revolution must take on popular demands of forming some kind of workers' government and spread that revolution across the country. It should go into the workplaces and involve all of the workers in a general strike against the government. And this general strike should actually form the embryo of a new government, which completely changes the situation, right? You should have a democratically planned economy based on the working classes of Lebanon, based on the people in the workplaces, based on the people in their unions, which uses Lebanon's wealth, which does exist, for the good of the people. So you can fix the crumbling infrastructure. So we can fix the low wages. So we can fix the food crisis. So this is the only way forward, really. It's the only thing that is available that's going to provide a future for the Lebanese masses. It's not the existing parties, and it's not any outside actors. And only by overthrowing the ruling class and putting the Lebanese masses in control of the economy and society can we see some kind of change. Only by not trusting these existing people. So what we need is to overthrow the ruling class of Lebanon. We need the Lebanese masses in control of the economy and society. And only in this way can we have a revolution that is victorious and that changes all the old, throws out all the old criminal garbage and forms something entirely new that can change not just Lebanon, but also spread to other countries in the Middle East and provide a future for the Arab masses.
Thank you, Adam. That was excellent. So we're going to open up the floor to discussion. And the way that this is going to work is, sorry, I see everyone applauding on the Zoom screen, so it's making me smile. It was really good. So the way that discussion is going to work, basically, we want this, like I said at the beginning, to be as normal an event as possible, as interactive as possible. So we welcome short questions, comments, maybe if you have something you disagree with that you are not sure about, you want a clarification on in the presentation. So basically what you should do is you should raise your hand. There's a raise hand feature in the Zoom chat. I believe it's at the bottom right corner. So you just raise your hand, and once your hand is raised, since I'm chairing the meeting, I will, give you the right to speak. I'll unmute you, and you'll be able to speak. And we absolutely encourage everyone who's going to speak to be on camera, because it's a very strange thing that we're living through, this COVID-19 situation. So we want to break the isolation and see each other. So if you can turn on your camera and speak, if possible, turn on your camera while you speak, that would be really encouraged. And I'm also going to ask you to limit your intervention to 3 minutes, because there's a lot of people on the chat, and we want everyone to get a chance to speak. And then after the discussion, I'm going to give the right to speak back to Adam, who's going to do a wrap up of the discussion, basically. So that's kind of how it's going to work. But before we move on to discussion, I just wanted to mention something. So I mentioned earlier that we are a socialist organization. We're called Socialist Fight Back. We're organizing this event. One of the crucial things that we do, and Adam has written a few articles on this question, on the Lebanese revolution, we publish our own paper. And we think it's absolutely vital that we have an independent voice for the working class in the movement, independent from the corporate media, so that we can actually have our own analysis and our own reporting on world events, on historic world events. And so we strongly encourage you to subscribe to it. I believe it's showing up on the screen, or it has shown up on the screen. If it hasn't, this is our latest issue. So strongly encourage people to subscribe to it. It's excellent. We write it ourselves, and we publish it monthly, so you can get a printed copy mailed to your door. You can also get an online subscription if you prefer. And I'll post the link on the chat. So without further ado, I already see some hands up. Like I said, I'm going to I have no, I'm Egyptian, so I have no qualms being a dictator. So if people are over 3 minutes, I will cut them short. I'm just letting you all know. So yeah, so why don't we start with Alex Myers. I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to mute myself first, and then I'll unmute.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Adam, for all that. Forgive me if you covered this in the first bit, because I came in a little late. Could you describe what the state of socialist or Marxist organizing is in Lebanon? Is there a viable workers' party? And who if not, some sort of Marxist organization do you think can lead that organizing on behalf of the working people of Lebanon? Thanks.
That's a very good question. Maybe someone in the chat also, in the Zoom chat, can also answer that. It doesn't necessarily have to be Adam, but that's a good question. And I'm going to give the right to speak now to the next person on the speakers list. Basically, is going to be Yassine. So I'm going to unmute you, Yassine.
Hi, thanks a lot for the awesome presentation, Adam. I had a question that's a bit in a similar vein to the precedent one, but I wanted to know, given what you've said about the ways in which both imperialism and the existing political parties and the institutional structures that are in place are kind of not trustworthy in order for the movement to go forward, and given that there are things to be done, as you've mentioned, what do you think is the most promising in terms of class consciousness and in terms of ability to lead the movement forward without falling into either of these traps, based on first the existing structures that have been that were born from last year's and this year's mass movements? I'm thinking about the structures of support, of care, of organizing. I've heard a little bit, for instance, about the fact that people are organizing themselves in order to feed themselves or to care in terms of healthcare, etc. First, and second, in terms of trade unions, do you know the situation? How does it look, especially given that you've mentioned how the movement going into workplaces and the possibility of a general strike, how important it would be? Do you know the potential of these institutions in Lebanon right now? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yassine. Also a very good question. And I strongly encourage, if you have questions, to really come in. This is a space to discuss. So, and we have a lot of time reserved for discussion. So please. So next on the list, I have Yobi. Go ahead, Yobi.
Hi. I do have two questions on the Lebanon crisis. So about the one of the questions that I like to ask was according to the aftermath of the Lebanese civil war, which was divided between the Christian and the Muslim, which was where the Muslim was supported by, according to the books I read, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and also Israel was on the side of a Christian, but I think they also participated in the war, and also after the Civil War, a treaty was signed. How would you, one of the questions I would ask is, how would you actually compare the Lebanese protest movement to other countries, like countries who are being corrupt, other countries that are being more, like for example, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, like the current Belarus movement, other countries? And another question I'd like to ask was that does the corruption affected the economy, and also what would happen, how to explain it? Oh, and also I do forgot to mention that after Lebanon gained independence, a pact was signed which gave power to the Muslim and Christian in the political system, where the president was to be a Maronite Christian and the prime minister was to be a Shia Muslim. What does it affect the democracy? Because the people were not able to elect their leaders, able to elect their president and prime minister. Does that mean that the political system in Lebanon was only restricted by religion? I mean, it's not even in my argument secular in nature. It's more restricted to, would I argue that it's more restricted to only a specific religion, not even in secular, where people have the right to say, people have the right to vote, not even secular. Would I argue that?
Yeah, thank you. Your 3 minutes are up. I think those are two very good questions. So we're gonna move on to the next speaker. Ali, you are next. So go ahead. Oops, I think I did the wrong thing. Sorry, hold on. Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having this very interesting subject. And I'm glad there's this many people on this discussion. I am Lebanese and I live in Lebanon, and I'm participating in the movement through the Lebanese Communist Party. And I can answer most of the questions asked before me. And yes, there is a solid workers party, which is the Lebanese Communist Party, and it's playing its vanguard role in the movement currently in the streets. And about the entire nature of the movement, it's very mixed, and it contains lots of components from both the extreme left to the extreme right. But the end goal, of course, is not the same, and the ways to achieve that goal are not the same. Some are calling for an early general election process, and others are calling for revolutionary violence. The thing is, there's a new coalition of leftist movements, including citizens in a country. It's called مواطنون and مواطنات في دولة MMFD, and the popular Nasserite organization, and of course the Lebanese Communist Party. Now, the goal of this coalition is to strive for a peaceful transition of power between the government and the people, and that is due to the nature of the volatile Lebanese social system. So a revolutionary or violent transition of power between the government and the people is going to be very hard to achieve and kind of unrealistic. So the current goal is to achieve peaceful transition of power. Now, this goal is not solid. It is not permanent. It can change according to the conditions and the timestamp that we're working with. So yeah, that's. I hope that answers some questions that you guys wanted to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I'm going to mute you now. Next, I have Julian on the speakers list. Then I have Wasan, and then I have Fatima, and then the speaker list is open. So please come in with your questions and comments. So go ahead, Julian. You are next.
My question is, what is the role of the United States in Lebanon? Because they generally have a big influence in this area, but I don't know really what they are doing in Lebanon.
Sorry, I...
Hi. Right, so I have a few questions, if anyone could answer them. The first of which is, in their definition of a technocrat that they're asking for, do they take in the possibility or the necessity of having a political affiliation of sorts, or at least a political belief, or not belief, sorry, a political system that they adhere to? Since, you know, I'm Sudanese, and our experience recently with technocrats hasn't been very promising, especially because of how they don't really apply any sort of real change, more like just subtle reforms and more IMF intervention. The second question is that with the MMFD and their whole peaceful transition into, you know, governance, do they have like a specific set of demands? If anyone could let me know, and what is it that they're focused on most? Thank you.
Thank you. Next I have Fatima. I just need to unmute you. Go ahead.
Okay, so Assalamu alaikum ya rifaq. Hello to all comrades and friends that have joined us today to talk about this important topic. I want to talk about the role of women in the Arab revolutions because it is an absolutely necessary component of the class struggle in the Middle East. And to be perfectly blunt, without the participation of women, there is no movement. There is no revolution. And if there is, it is absolutely doomed to fail. One thing that is worth highlighting is the fact that Western media often likes to underplay the role of women in these movements. They prefer to paint them as these meek creatures in order to prop up their so-called Western democracy and justify their imperialism, which, as a side note, this amazing Western democracy that gave them Donald Trump and the likes of Joe Biden, they can keep that Western democracy. Quite frankly, I think we're good without it. But actually, if you notice, they only levy the issue of women's oppression when it's convenient, when it helps them to undermine movements of this scale. They'll paint these women as meek, quiet figures, but this could not be further from the truth. And that's exactly what the Arab revolutions and the revolutionary movements from 2011 until now have shown us. Lenin once said that the success of a revolution depends on the extent to which women take part in it. And I would say that the Arab revolutions, the 2011 Arab Spring, is a fine example. And just to give you an idea, in Yemen, going back to 2011 now, when the president at the time, President Saleh, said it was un-Islamic for male and female protesters to march side by side. What happened after that? Thousands of women poured onto the streets just to prove him wrong. And it was actually a young woman, Tawakkul Karman, who led the first initial demonstration on a university campus against the long rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh. A protester by the name of Faiza Soleimani in Yemen hints that even though they're not explicitly calling for equality, and instead are raising economic demands, women in Yemen have found themselves being taken, in her words, much more seriously by men because of the impressive way that they've contributed to the protest movement. In Egypt, Egyptian women have a long history of being active members of trade unions, organizations, informal networks, and communities in protest. In the earlier protests in Egypt, women only accounted for 10% of the protesters initially, but on Tahrir Square, they accounted for about 50% of the protesters leading up to the fall of Mubarak in 2011. Women with and without hijabs, without the veil, participated in the defense of the square, set up barricades, led debates, shouted slogans, and together with men risked their lives. Involved in the nitty-gritty organization that turned Tahrir Square from a brief moment to a movement. In Bahrain, which is where I'm from, and I actually witnessed the brave role that women played in the Arab Spring when I was there. Women were among the first that descended on Pearl Square in the capital, which was a center for the revolution, to demand change. Women led strikes and so on and so forth. I could go on. Of course, I can't talk about this without mentioning Sudan. I'm sure you've all seen the famous image of the woman protester in a white abaya, a white garment, surrounded by a sea of protesters with her hand raised. At one point in Sudan, women accounted for about 70% of protesters on the streets, something amazing like that. And many of what I'm saying might be specific to 2011, but what we've seen in 2019 in countries such as Lebanon and Algeria, and what we are about to see inevitably, is a revival of these movements. And when this moment comes, and it will come, women and men will remember these traditions that were built through experience, traditions where workers put aside differences of gender to fight towards a common cause. And that is something only experience can teach. And they'll not only remember these traditions, but build and develop past them. And the role that women played in 2011 is certainly not over, because women's oppression in the Middle East and around the world is not over. And in the words of Egyptian woman Reham Muntaz, who is an Egyptian teacher that participated in the 2011 movement, they very much encapsulate this fact. She said the fact that through experience, solidarity is built beyond gender. She says women's perception of themselves has been changed through the struggle. She says, we have suffered the taste of tear gas, but we are not afraid. The women who are afraid to leave the house, even they see us and they gain courage. And so if the Arab revolutions have taught us anything, it's that the road to the emancipation of women is through class struggle. The Arab revolution will recruit its most determined and courageous fighters from the ranks of women, because the place of women is not in the kitchen, but it's on the streets fighting alongside men. We are the most fearless elements and we have the most to fight for. So thank you guys. Thawra hatta Nasr, revolution until victory.
Thank you for that excellent intervention, Fatima. Next on the list, I have Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I'll unmute you and you can go ahead. Hold on. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry. With the CIA, we know that they don't like communism, and that they will do everything to undermine it. We see it in Venezuela, we see it in Bolivia, we see it in Brazil. So if we're able to get a revolution in Lebanon, what can we do to protect them, to make sure that they don't get labeled dictators, they don't get labeled all of these buzzwords that gets the United Nations involved and try to put sanctions on them, and you have to do it this way. So how can we protect the people in Lebanon from outside forces? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Next, I have Fair on the list. Go ahead, Fair.
Hi. Yeah, it's an exciting time to live. I guess we could say we have the misfortune of living in exciting times, in interesting times, and that comes with both the bad and the good. And this is something that I think, after the experience of the last wave of the Arab revolutions, I think a lot of people became very demoralized by the experience of those revolutions, by the way that they ended, by the intervention of imperialism in Libya in order to maneuver their people to the top, the Islamists, and then the same in Syria, and really we saw basically the rise of counter-revolution. But at the end of the day, we do have to always keep in mind that the battle is not actually decided ahead of time. It's decided by a struggle of living forces. It's decided by the masses in action on the streets. And if we kind of allow previous defeats to decide our attitude to the revolutions today, to say, well, it can only inevitably lead to civil war, or oh, it can only inevitably lead to, you know, American-backed or French-backed or Israeli-backed regime, or whatever other kind of conspiracy-flavored way out of paying attention to what's happening in Lebanon. You can convince yourself, because that's basically what it comes down to. Basically, you've decided what the end of this revolution is going to be before it's already happened, and therefore you tune out. And so it's very important for us as Marxists, we don't do that. We're going to pay attention to what's happening in Lebanon. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be the possibility of mass organizations popping up, you know, ad hoc organizations, like when in Barcelona you had committees. Even in Egypt, you had neighborhood committees that popped up. In Sudan, you had neighborhood committees that popped up. These kinds of things can actually emerge in the struggle. What can't emerge in the struggle, really, unfortunately, is an actual revolutionary leadership. But the masses are learning very quickly, and the ruling class has no possibility of decisively ending these movements. So yes, maybe the overthrow of capitalism is not on the agenda in the next year or two, right? Maybe that's not what the consequence is going to be of this immediate latest wave. But every wave brings more and more youth to the conclusion that all of them means all of them, as Adam was saying, and that we need to overthrow the entire system. And so if we put in the work now to begin to draw together the elements that understand that the revolution needs to continue and go further, and strike at the very base of the property of the ruling class itself, continue to bring these people together, and build an organization on the ground that can actually play that role, then the events that are happening now are such explosive events that a very small organization can actually find itself in a matter of in a short space of time in a situation to actually play a decisive role. But we have to pay attention to what's happening and take inspiration from this first of the next wave, this first revolution of the next wave of our revolutions. And of course, it doesn't stop in Lebanon. Somebody said Lebanon on its own can't withstand imperialist attack, and so it would have to spread across the Middle East. And our duty in terms of solidarity with the Lebanese masses would be to work towards a revolution here too, to tie the hands of the imperialists and prevent them from creating a new mandate in Lebanon and in Syria, which is really what they've been trying to do since the beginning of their attempts to destroy the Arab revolutions.
Thank you, Fer. Next on the list, I have Ben. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, really good discussion so far. I learned a lot from the lead off and from Adam's article on the website. You can check out marxist.com to read it for a nice in-depth dive into it. I'm not an expert on Lebanon, but I do know a few things about the IMF. And the IMF has been offered by Macron, by the imperialist powers, as an answer to Lebanon's problem. As Adam mentioned, Lebanon is one of the most indebted countries in the world, and of course, this debt load is heavy burden on the shoulders of the Lebanese people, particularly the Lebanese working class, which has taken the brunt of trying to pay off this awful debt. One of the things that they tried to do that's well known is the WhatsApp tax, an extremely regressive tax that taxes the people who are least able to pay to try and pay off this mountain of debt. And the IMF presents no real solution to Lebanon's problems, and in fact they would actually compound these problems if they take this IMF debt relief. Everywhere where the IMF has gone, it has made problems worse. Just look at countries like Jamaica or Greece or Ireland, which has taken IMF debt, IMF so-called relief. And of course, this financial relief, comes with strings attached, right? This isn't just like free money that they can pay back at their leisure. Every time a country accepts IMF finance, it comes with requirements for what you have to do to your economy. It requires countries to take on austerity measures, like that WhatsApp tax, and we would probably see even worse WhatsApp taxes or regressive taxes like that. And of course, cuts to services. Adam already talked about the lack of garbage disposal. It would probably get even worse if they're forced to cut even more. And that's really all that the IMF is at the end of the day. It's a tool. It's an enforcement mechanism for imperialism to make sure that all countries around the world are accepting the necessary economic reforms that are required of them from imperialism. That makes Lebanon the best place, a good place for exploiting cheap labor, for taxing them into the dirt, and making everything worse. You can see what happened in Jamaica, for example, when they accepted IMF funds. Their debt only got higher and things only got worse for Jamaicans. So this is a totally false solution presented to the people of Lebanon by imperialism. We shouldn't buy into this for 1 second. We should fight against austerity and fight against the capitalist system that's causing these problems in the first place.
Thank you, Ben. After Ben, I have Juan. Go ahead, Juan, you are next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the great lead off, Adam, and for everybody's intervention so far. Somebody did ask the question if we can make any connections to the movements that have been happening around the world, such as Venezuela and Chile. And if I'm just going to take a second or two to touch on Chile, because the movements that was sparked there was sparked, there was a slogan that it was not 30 pesos, it was 30 years, because, it was a small increase in bus fare that supposedly sparked the whole movement. But really, it was, the ferment and the anger that had been building for so long in the Chilean society and in the working class and the poor. And then another speaker talked about, the oppression of women, in Lebanon and in Latin America and in Chile, there's huge levels of machismo and femicide, and in the past couple of years, we've seen big movements, around women for the right to abortion, legalized abortion, and, other reforms for women. But we can see a lot of the same issues, whether in Lebanon, in Chile and Venezuela, or even in Canada. So that's one thing that we should take into account. And another thing is that as Marxists, we look at things dialectically. So one of the things that we say is that, necessity is expressed through accident. So in Chile, it was the small raise in bus fare that expressed the necessity, and that's when the masses acted. And in Lebanon, we could almost say the same thing that with the explosion, right? The explosion was the accident, but really the necessity for change was already there, and it's been there for a long time. So if it wasn't the explosion, then it could have been something else, right? But so that's one thing. Now, if we were to learn any lessons, from other revolutions and other revolutionary movements, we can look at Venezuela. And one of the things that the IMT has been saying for decades was that you can't have half a revolution, right? And that's something that the Lebanese workers are going to have to learn. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if the workers don't control the main levers of the economy, if you don't begin to dismantle the state, including the army and the police, if you don't put if you don't nationalize the banks under democratic workers' control, if you don't get the labor movement involved, if you don't get the youth involved, then a lot of this effort that the masses are showing right now will come up short. Yes, it will, always, of course, affect their consciousness, but the main goal is to transform society. So some things will be needed, and these are some of the things that will be needed. So just to sum up, it will be important for the Lebanese workers to, to have a Marxist perspective if they want to gain power, and for us it'll be important for us to continue to monitor the situation and analyze it dialectically. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mute myself. I hope that wasn't too disruptive. So next I have on the list, Matani. You are next. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead. Sorry, hold on, it's not working. Okay, now you're unmuted.
All right. Yeah, I think that the Lebanese workers this year have really shown us what it means to fight. During a pandemic and throughout less than a year, they managed to topple down 2 governments. The ruling class has left the Lebanese people without homes. It left them hungry. It left them without a currency, really without anything but a burning passion to make things right and get the justice that they deserve. And you look at the conditions and you'd understand why that is happening, right? Like 45% of the Lebanese population were projected in 2020 to be living in poverty. In March, the government defaulted on its own debt. And that is because the government, sitting billionaires and millionaires sitting there, were gambling all this money that they milk out of the masses. And they from imperialists like Adam mentioned from France. Now the ruling class, you have them, they're gambling with people's lives and through complete negligence, literally blew up the people of Lebanon. They left 300,000 people homeless, and now they're trying to co-opt the movement, as Adam also mentioned in his leadoff. The Kitab Party is trying to use the people on the ground who've lost everything so that they can then form another government that's also just as criminal, just as negligent. The people of Lebanon should really know, and this is like a message for them, is that what you need is already in your hands. You've shown your power. You've proved that these sectarian and religious lines, they're so insignificant when compared to your ability to have all these millionaires, all these crooks with all their guns and all their millions step down when you're on the streets. You have the power to run this country for your own. And I think just to kind of like point out, you should learn from the lessons of the Sudanese revolution in 2019. One of the attendees here, Wesson, brought up the technocrats and the reformists. And the Sudanese revolution was put in the same position. They managed to top down also 2 dictators in a matter of just a weekend. But it was co-opted. The movement was co-opted by these technocrats and these reformists by saying they want to form a civilian government. And that sounds catchy, right? It sounds like they're doing it for the civilians, for the people. But in the matter of the fact is that they did not address the issues in society based on class. They did not challenge privatizations. They did not challenge international banking. They did not put forward a program for a planned economy, for nationalization, for utilizing all this money that's in society for the Sudanese people. Right? And that is what the Lebanese people should learn from the lessons of the Sudanese revolution. Put forward the socialist program. Trust no one but yourselves, because what you need is your own power, and you have that, right? You have the power to inspire the rest of the masses in the region. Here, we're in Canada, and we are inspired by the Lebanese revolution. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Matani. That was excellent. Next, we have Ramir. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Sorry. I'm going to unmute you. I hope it works. Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah. So I took some notes here to answer a few things. First of all, just as a bit of insight, I moved to Canada at the beginning of this year. I was part of the revolution that in Lebanon that started in October, but I had already planned for immigration, so I moved here. And I would like to answer a few things. So first of all, someone asked about the website of the Muwatinun Muwatinat fi Dawla, that is one of the sides in the revolution that wants peaceful transition. So it's mmfidawla.com. Someone wanted to see what they're about, and they have a nice website for this. Second of all, I just wanted to comment that the financial crisis in Lebanon didn't happen because of defaulting on the debt. It's because of one of the biggest planned Ponzi schemes in the world, where the central bank and the banks gave people insanely high interest rates for setting up saving accounts, and like for like 10%, 11% on their savings, and they didn't have the money for this. So basically, they would give people the interest, but it's actually fake digital money. It's not real cash. And when people wanted to take their money out of the banks, they had no more cash. And this began a whole black market of conversion from USD to Lebanese pounds, even though officially the Lebanese pound is still the same value as it used to be a year ago. Second of all, I want to talk about like the difference between a revolution in a place like Syria and a place like other Arab countries and Lebanon. The huge difference is that in these countries you have one dictator, we have one head, one person to fight, to unite against. But in Lebanon, you have basically a sort of oligopoly of mafias. Now, people working together, and you can see this pattern in the elections where in the not the past elections, but the ones before, they used to be in lists against each other. In the previous elections, they noticed that the public opinion was becoming against them, and so they changed the electoral law in a way that would get them into being in the government again. And in addition to that, they decided to unite on lists together against all the other independent lists, and this is how they got elected again. But most notably, this was the first time in recent modern years, we would have one independent person in the government, not politically affiliated. These political parties, they're all headed by previous warlords and terrible people who get into power with time because they're part of the government and they make the government be incompetent, leading to people depending more on them. So people who don't have any power will need to depend, or money will need to ask for favors from these head of mafias or political leaders to get a job somewhere. And basically they'll tell you, no, why would I revolt against this guy? He got me a job, he fed my family, he fed my kids, etc. And so this is what makes the situation a lot more complicated. And like, this is one of the things that they even work in, some of them even work in the drug trade. We have a lot of cartels in east of Lebanon who have deals with some political parties to benefit financially. Example, Hezbollah, who also have been caught dealing drugs around the world, not only in Lebanon. And you also have something which is unrelated to this, I want to talk about as well, which is the cut down on freedom of speech. It's a pattern we've been seeing recently in Lebanon, where they don't really do it in an authoritarian way, but what they would do is they would basically scare people by inviting them to get into being interrogated by the Lebanese FBI or CIA or NSA style thing, intelligence agencies in Lebanon, where they would, for example, let's say they insulted someone or they tried to uncover some corruption by some political leader, they would get invited and they would have to sign a paper where they would swear no longer to insult this person or to write about this issue of this person doing this bit of corruption. I've personally been interrogated before for something else unrelated, and I didn't get physically attacked, but they do a lot of intimidation tactics, and you're left there for 6 to 7 hours, even sometimes for days. I didn't have to sign anything, but some other people will have to sign something in order for them to be released. So it's basically conditional release. So yeah, I just wanted to raise these issues for you to basically get a bigger understanding of things, of why it's pretty different. I'm not sure I've seen a situation similar to the one in Lebanon in terms of fighting a group of mafias instead of just one or two sides. There's just huge side. And they use this tactic, which is the fear of others that a lot of dictators do. So a fear of even Trump. So a fear of the other, a fear of the enemy, a fear of the other person. They use it inside of Lebanon between religions. So the Muslims fearing the other Muslim sect, or the Christians fearing the Muslims. They keep using this fear to, keep people separated and depending on them, keep them weak, keep them poor, and they're easier to control. And one last thing, I hope I'm not over the time. It's someone asked about the role of the US in Lebanon, and I want to say that it's the role of all the external powers in Lebanon. It's still sort of like a Cold War all the time. People in Lebanon always want to depend on someone else. The US and Saudi Arabia used to back the Muslim Sunnis, for example. And at some point after Mohammed bin Salman came to power in Saudi Arabia, we noticed some pull out from Saudi Arabia. They stopped supporting as much as they used to before. And now we're noticing a push from Turkey and Erdogan to replace Saudi Arabia as the backer of the Muslim Sunnis. So instead of them relying on their own themselves, they always want to rely on some backer from the outside. So this is another thing to note. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Joel, who's sitting right next to me. So Joel, you can go ahead.
Well, thank you. I just had a couple of things to say. I've been a Marxist for like 15 years or so, and I remember talking about the Middle East, always revolutionary perspectives for the Middle East, about Lebanon, about Syria, about Saudi Arabia, about Egypt, about Iran, you talk about, and especially about Lebanon, but about generally when you talk about politics in the Middle East, someone always says, it's too hard. Workers of the world unite. Are you crazy? It's impossible. You can't have it. Not in Lebanon. Never in Lebanon. Everyone's so divided. It's impossible. Or not in. Can't have it in Palestine. Can't have it in Israel. Impossible. No one will ever unite across these divides. I'll tell you, people will, and people are, and people in Lebanon are proving all these cynics wrong. And actually, we said for a long time, no, workers will unite. That the pressure of capitalism and the crisis makes them realize eventually that it's a big game that people are playing to divide us on whatever lines, on the line, the color of your skin, on what religion, on what type of Muslim you are in the Middle East. It gets a bit ridiculous, actually, the divisions that they can pit us against each other when it's really just to make us fight each other so we're not fighting them. And they're really a bunch of, especially in a country like Lebanon, but in a lot of Middle Eastern countries. But come on, to be honest, even in Canada, they're a bunch of gangsters, man, look at what Trudeau did with this WE scandal. It's giving millions of dollars to his friends. Anyway, so they're trying to divide us along whatever possible line they can find. And therefore, I think what's been proved in Lebanon, people may have seen some videos on this of protesters on the streets. There's one that I particularly liked. It was a young woman doing a chant, and the end of every line was "Revolution in all countries," and it wasn't about Lebanon actually. It was about the Middle East. It was about actually the whole world, which is workers of the world unite in different words. So I think sometimes people say Marxism is utopian or it's disconnected. I think that what's happening in Lebanon is actually proven that it's not. It's theories drawn from the experience, the concrete reality, the experience. And I think what's happening, not just in Lebanon, I think the Arab Spring showed that. There was a lot of people saying, oh, you'll never have it in the Arab world. People are too dumb, or they love dictators, or they're too religious or something or whatever. And then it happened in Tunisia. People say it never happened in Egypt. It's different. Mubarak is too strong. He pays the soldiers too well, blah, blah, blah. What happened? It's overthrown, And I think people say the same thing. And I think we have the right to be optimistic. And an event like this proves that we have the right to be optimistic. Now, does this mean that you're going to overthrow capitalism in Lebanon tomorrow? I don't think so. not to be pessimistic, but I think there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. And but I'm confident that people, the traditions in the Middle East, a lot of people don't know that. They think that religious sectarianism it's always been that way. No, it hasn't. It's very new. Historically, it's very recent. As a political tradition, religious sectarianism is very recent. The tradition through most of the 20th century was revolutionary, communist, Marxist, or at least socialist or left-wing nationalist. And actually, a large part of the religious sectarians, the religious fundamentalists were paid for, were funded by and propped up and fostered by imperialism in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, even in Lebanon, as Adam explained. So I think that the people have a revolutionary tradition, a class tradition, an internationalist tradition, a Marxist tradition that they will, and they are in the process of rediscovering. And it's our task as internationalists, as we're doing here today, to help them rediscover that and to fight for a voluntary socialist federation of the Middle East linked to a socialist world. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. After Joel, I have George. George, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, George.
Hi there. I'm not quite as good as you guys. You guys are very well versed in all this, but I come from Honduras, and that's where I launched my revolution from. I'm actually from Alberta, but I've lived there for 10 years, and I have this philosophy of first Honduras. Now that could be first Haiti, that could be first Lebanon, but everybody talks about all these divisions, and they are not complicated at all. The Middle East is one place, and there are 1,000 problems in it. But as soon as you get to the top of these problems, you quickly find that there is usually one person sitting in one office and with one signature that can do all of this for us. So for us here, sitting here watching it and making it this great big complicated thing, it's not. It's really not, because the people that can affect the change for us here in Canada, they're sitting in Ottawa right now, and they go for coffee at Starbucks every day at noon, and they are putting policies out into the world that cause so much pain, all to protect mining interest, extractivism, and they make these divisions amongst all of us. We've heard this today. Since the French controlled Lebanon, they have been picking and choosing whatever force will get them what they want, and as soon as they abandon that, that group is no longer popular. And then they just pick another one, and they pick another one. And then you get these situations where each country has extreme elements of corruption and crime, and it could be done across ideological lines. They've exploited communism against us. They've done everything. It doesn't matter. They have no ideology. They have no lines. It's not complicated. There's probably like 10 offices in power that we could walk into, and it would completely change the world tomorrow. So that's my non-college pipe fitter version of events, I think. Thanks.
Thank you, George. That was great. Next on the speakers list, I have Khaled. Khaled. Computer is slow. It takes a while for it to unmute. Okay, you are unmuted. Go ahead. Khaled, we can't hear you for some reason. Hello? Okay, I'm gonna mute Khaled for now, and maybe they can go next. So next on the list, I have Camille. Camille, you can go ahead and speak.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, one of the things that is interesting that most of the opposition groups are saying is that well, the Lebanese ruling class is corrupt and all of that, which is correct. But here there I see like an attempt to separate politics from economics. right? That it's only because there's a corrupt group of politicians we have this problem, right? And I'll quote Lenin here. And Lenin said, "Politics is concentrated economics, right?" And this is really, I think, the key for the whole situation. Why do you have this corrupt regime? It is literally falling apart, and the reason is Lebanon was set up this way. This is a country that was set up to be like this, to be a small country, be a financial hub and a tourist hub, completely dependent on the world market, and especially on Western imperialism, and a point of support for Western imperialism, really. That it doesn't really produce much in terms of like industry, right? And on the basis of this, there is a very parasitic ruling class, right? It's completely connected to outside interests. And after the civil war, this got much worse, actually. After 15 years of destruction, whatever was left of Lebanon was destroyed. And Hariri, the father of current Hariri, is the engineer of Lebanon of today, which is even more, which is an economy that is even more parasitic and more dependent on the world market. And Hariri was actually a double agent. He served both the Saudi ruling class and the Syrian regime, and he balanced between them. And at the end, he messed up and he got blown up. But and then his son, who's kind of blaming Hezbollah and all the Lebanese, the Christian old parties like the Forces and Kataib, they're blaming. Well, Hezbollah has a hand too in this because they support the government. But it was them who set up this country this way, way before Hezbollah, right? And for example, Lebanon imports 80% of its consumption needs of food and industry. This is a country that has everything: land, beautiful weather, that can produce a lot of things, right? And the essence of the current crisis is that Lebanon is completely dependent on the American dollar to buy its needs from abroad, right? And its main export is actually its own people, right? The Lebanese have to immigrate abroad to send back money to their parents, right? So Lebanon can buy things, right, on the world market, and also, of course, other like financial operations. But since the world crisis of 2008 and the civil war in Syria and the whole chaos in the region, the ability of Lebanon to attract US dollars has been reduced a lot, and this has created an imbalance in the banking system. And this is really the basis of the current crisis. That's why, as the previous speaker said, there's a Ponzi scheme that the central bank was trying to attract dollars to kind of rebalance the budget, the import-export budget, and be able to buy things. That's why there is so many shortages of things like oil and wheat and such. So this is a completely parasitic system economically, and just as a political setup, right? The political setup is a reflection of this economic system. And here I would like to kind of touch on the question of what forces are there today in Lebanon to perhaps lead the movement. And there's a comrade from the Communist Party who spoke. And I think the Communist Party has taken some good positions, saying, all of them have to go and such. But unfortunately, just to say that we just have to, get rid of this political ruling class and set up a new government outside the political elite, and this would be a transition. Everything would be fine. I don't think this really adds up. It sounds just, to be honest, the Communist Party sounds just like another liberal party or a left liberal party. What would be the basis of this government? Would be the same would be capitalism. Would be the banks, the export-import mafias of Lebanon, the same economic interests that actually support the current political regime. It's impossible, right? It's impossible to have a different kind of regime or a different kind of government on the basis of this economic system, right? And that's why I really support what some comrades have said, that you really need a transformation of society. And the Communist Party actually, which is very small now compared to what it used to be, but it still has cadres and roots and has very good traditions, right? And an honorable history as well, right? And it could become a mass party actually if it would organize differently, if it would drop the idea of I see what Hanna Gharib is saying and the leadership of the Communist Party. We just need some sort of a unity government, united with the national bourgeoisie, and build the state that is the bourgeois state, right? it's impossible to have a real bourgeois state in a stable one in Lebanon. I mean, this what we have now is a bourgeois state, right? What we have now is a national unity government. It's the unity of all the thieves, all representing the different layers of the capitalist class, right? So if the Communist Party would to go to the working class, which it has experienced, by the way, the Communist Party of Syria and Lebanon used to be united, built the labor movement and built all the unions in Lebanon and in Syria. And still has and of course fought Israel before it was driven out by Hezbollah, right? And unfortunately, in the last few years, the Communist Party supported Hezbollah and kind of followed it, right? Which is wrong in my opinion. I think now I see like the leadership is separating itself a bit from Hezbollah, but the Communist Party, if it is to organize the ruling class, if it goes to workplaces and organize the workers on the basis of socialism, right? You don't have to have a civil war. You don't have to have an armed uprising at the moment. But if you start organizing the workers, rebuild the workers' movement on socialist basis with the idea of seizing the economy out of the hand of the capitalist, and organizing a planned economy, right? I mean, this is how the Communist Party, the Syrian and Lebanese Communist Party, which used to be united, as I said, was organized as part of the Comintern, right, which came from the Russian Revolution. How did the Russian Revolution come to power, right? How was it? How could it be victorious? It was by expropriating the bourgeoisie, right, and building a socialist economy. This is what we need today, really. And I think it's in terms of what existing forces today in Lebanon, political forces, that the Communist Party is the only clean force, is the only force that could potentially build them as party today of the oppressed and the working class. But as I mentioned, the idea of some sort of a unity government and some sort of building a bourgeois state that is stable has to be dropped. And we have to go directly to the workers and rebuild the workers' movement from the scratch with the ideas of socialism, really. And I will echo what Fair said too, that now it might look difficult, but we start with ones and twos, and Lebanon is literally falling apart like the rest of the region. Like, if we are scared of civil war, well, civil war is coming. It would be like Rosa Luxemburg used to say, socialism or barbarism, right? That's my opinion. If the working class doesn't seize power, it will be another civil war eventually, right? Because literally we have a failing state in Lebanon today, and in many countries, right? And with imperialist intervention, right? So that's all I have to say. The last thing I have to say is I feel really sorry for what happened in Beirut. I'm Syrian, but I used to go there a lot, and it really breaks my heart, like to see this happens to Beirut. I know that Beirut is they're really proud of Beirut, and they praise it a lot, and they say it's the Paris of the Middle East. Maybe it's a bit exaggerated, but Beirut is already a special city, a very, very unique place, and it's really heartbreaking. It's a crime what's been done to Beirut with this criminal negligence of the ruling class, and I hope out of this tragedy something good will come out. People are awake in big way, and there's nothing else to lose, like but to fight now for a future. It's hopefully we'll have to with socialism. That's the only way out. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Camille. That was excellent. We're actually running out of time, so I'm gonna give it back to Adam. I do invite everybody to on the Zoom call, and people who are watching on Facebook, if they want to join the Zoom call, there's a link that they can just join. We're going to have, usually after these events, we go out for drinks and talk informally more about the topics and other political discussions we just have more informally. So we decided we're going to keep the Zoom call open for that purpose after Adam's wrap up. So Adam, I'm going to give it back to you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I thought it was an excellent discussion, and I'm very glad to see people that have been involved in the movement and are involved in the movement joining us for this call. Yeah, I want to echo a bit of what Camille said about the Lebanese Communist Party, because I think one of the positive things that came out of this movement, and I think the Communist Party can take some credit for this, is the rejection of any outside interference and the trying to cut across sectarianism, which is quite good. But what I see as the problem, and this whole discussion is sort of circulated around this to an extent, is there is really a crisis of leadership within Lebanon and really around the world, where you have a situation, you could take Lebanon as an example, where the masses are moving quite rapidly towards radical change and are committing themselves to revolutions, in fact, and cutting across all the problems. Someone said, look, Lebanon is quite unique in how divided it is. But the masses have shown that such division can be easily overcome in a period of struggle. And this is what they've been doing for the past period. So you have the masses, which are rapidly approaching the question of fixing society. But the leadership and the organizations around the masses have not been quite bold enough. And this would be the crux of the criticism of the LCP, for example, where you have a situation where it's just kind of rebranding the technocratic government slogan. It's saying we need an independent civilian commission to investigate corruption, etc. And we need some kind of, civilian government that's outside all of these political powers. But the truth is that that's not nearly enough. And reaffirming democratic institutions in a country like Lebanon, democratic institutions, unless the workers are in power, will always look like this. They will always look like people lining the pockets of officials. They will always look like a deep sectarian divide. Because in a country like Lebanon, the only way that a ruling class, which by its nature has to be parasitic due to the way the country is set up and to its relationship with imperialism, a parasitic ruling class can only maintain the country through dividing the workers. So it's not an accident. It's not like there happened to be all of these things that crashed into the same place and became Lebanon. It's not an accident at all. The sectarianism is tied to the ruling class. It's tied to the fact that if you set up some kind of democracy in the Middle East and you give people freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of criticism, what they will do is they will come with pitchforks at the ruling class. So the ruling class has to divide them in some way. It has to separate them and cordon them off to their individual corners. And so what you actually need is you need an entirely new class of people to take power in a country like Lebanon. You need the workers in power. And in this situation where the masses are in the streets and they're really just, they're putting up gallows and demanding that we kill the political elites. It's quite amazing. So in this kind of situation, to limit the demands that you make to simply, we want a more thorough democracy, it's not enough, and it will not catch the ears or the inspiration of the masses, which realistically want much more. They want an entire shakeup of society. And sometimes people don't quite know, consciously that this is exactly what's needed. But if you tell them, look, we need to get rid of all this corruption and we need working people to take power, this is a slogan that people can get behind. And there's been a failure of leadership to an extent, and there continues to be to do that. So the trade unions are another example. Someone asked about them. The trade unions after the Civil War were restructured in such a way that they're deeply sectarian leadership. And there has not been really unity using the trade union movement across the working class. Before the Civil War, there was quite a deep union tradition and quite a deep history of socialist and communist politics. But after the Civil War, that was wiped out in many ways and replaced with this vulgar sectarianism based around religion. So what you have is a situation where the masses are extremely ready for change, radical change, but the leadership has not been able to actually present that to the masses. And, that is the shame of the situation, because if you had bold leadership, what you could do is you could actually present these radical demands. And it's my belief that these demands would pick up almost instantly. I think many people would immediately look to an organization that was bold enough to call for the workers to take power. But such an organization, it would have to be bold. It would have to tie itself to the working class and would have to put the issue of class independence first and foremost. So not only are the masses not divided on sectarian lines, they form no unity whatsoever with the ruling clique that currently runs Lebanon. There is no situation where the working class must play second fiddle to the ruling class and say, it's okay if you stay in power as long as you promise us this, etc. No, instead, the workers are in a position that the ruling class has effectively shown them through this crisis that they are unable and actually, in many ways don't want to be competent administrators. This is the basis of any kind of quote unquote social contract. The ruling class is supposed to run society well. Well, in Lebanon, they have not, and really around the world, they have not. So why should they run society? No, I think instead what we need is we need the workers in power, and we need a strong organization to head that up. And that organization has to be built, through existing institutions, but also existing organizations, but also, brand new organizations that are going to come onto the scene of history. The trade unions, all the leadership that is filled with these sectarian crooks have to be kicked out, and the organizations of the working class have to be revived in many ways, etc. We need a leadership in Lebanon and across the world. And so if you liked what you heard today, what I would encourage you to do is to support what we do. We're members of the International Marxist Tendency. And what we want, sorry, I heard an echo. We're members of the International Marxist Tendency, and what we want is we want to build that leadership that is needed in Lebanon and across the world, so that when the masses do move, like we're seeing now, they not only topple governments, but they replace governments. They not only change society, but they take power within society and build a society that's actually worth living in for regular working people across the world. So join us, talk to some of our activists after this meeting, get involved in the struggle abroad, but also in Lebanon itself. And I look forward to the day when we can say that there is a Socialist Federation of the Middle East that has abolished the criminal neglect of the ruling class.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you everybody for attending and for intervening and for asking these wonderful questions. I hope they were answered. If you want to discuss more informally, again, I encourage you to stay on the call. I also want to make a final appeal to donate to fight back. As you know, as I mentioned earlier, this event costs us money. It takes organizing. It takes a lot of resources to organize these kinds of things, and we need the support. So if you just want to donate a little something as to show your support, that would be greatly appreciated. You can do so at you can e-transfer something at finance@marxist.ca, or there's a link on Zoom chat where you can subscribe to our paper and support us that way, and you would get access to our wonderful Marxist analysis of world events. So that's it. That's it for our event. I hope you enjoyed it, and there will be more to come. And long live the revolution. Okay, so.